DiscipleOn communities, especially for our guests, let you know that DiscipleOn communities are communities of 10 discipleship leaders in congregations, leaders who are leading discipleship from the stages perspective of discipleship. And these communities meet for 90 minutes once a month over 5 months. The middle month, we bring in an expert who is really applying this in their field, and we get the chance to converse with them and ask them questions. And today we have with us Richard Webb and Mary Stier, and I'm going to introduce them in a couple of minutes. But DiscipleOn is a service of ascending leaders. Now, Richard and Mary, I met Richard through Ascending Leaders vice chair of our board, and she knows Mary and introduced Richard and I, and we sat together several months ago, and Richard was telling me about what they're doing at Lutheran Church of Hope, and I thought, oh man, more need to hear about this. So Richard Webb is the director of discipleship at Lutheran Church of Hope. He's been there for 16 years, I think, Richard. And Mary just retired 2 weeks ago after 5 years as director of women's ministries. Lutheran Church of Hope is a 12,000 person church over 5 campuses, soon to be 6 campuses in the Des Moines area. And Richard and Mary have been applying what Richard would call developmental perspective of discipleship, which I would often call stages perspective. It's the same thing there, and they've got a lot to share with us. Let me briefly just say how this webinar is going to go. We basically have about 20 DiscipleOn participants on this call, or on this Zoom video, and they will be interacting with Richard and Mary. Verbally, they'll raise their hands and ask questions, and we'll have a conversation around. Also, there's around another 35 guests on this call, and the guests are here complimentary. They're able to hear the conversations and listen in on it and watch it, and they also can ask questions. Now, for them to ask questions, they need to use the chat feature, and I believe Katie is going to show us how to use the chat feature. Katie, it looks like we have one of the files coming up ahead of us. But basically, what you do for chat is you go down to the lower right-hand corner of your, towards the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and you'll see a little thought bubble, and underneath it says chat. Click on that, and then you should have a box open, and in that box you can type any questions you have. So if you open that, you'll see that Katie says, "Hello everyone, we're glad you're here," and you can just submit your questions there, and then we may not be able to answer all the questions or ask all the questions, but we will be pulling the questions that especially seem to fit, and we'll be asking those of Richard and Mary, in addition to the DiscipleOn participants asking questions. Basically, we'll begin with Richard and Mary sharing some things for about 20-30 minutes, and then from there we'll open it up just to a wide-ranging conversation around the topics that they've raised. Before we go any further, I'd like to introduce 2 people. One is Katie Best. Say hi, Katie.
Hey, everybody.
Katie is our DiscipleOn assistant, and we like to refer to her as the Queen of Technology. She should be able to help us with all technology issues. Also, Ken Scripsman. Say hi, Ken.
Hi, all.
Ken is the other facilitator of the DiscipleOn communities, and so we are pleased that you're all here, and we're going to have a great time together. So let's just begin. And Richard, why don't you take us away?
All right. I want to give you just a very quick overview of who is Hope, our discipleship team, and then also take a look at the document you have, Core Concepts That Drive Us. Lutheran Church of Hope is in a city of about 500,000 people. Like Mike said, we are of 5 campuses going on 6 in about a month. Our weekend worship attendance across all campuses is about 12,000. If you were to think of our strengths are evangelism, worship, children's ministry, and missions. When Lutherans say mission, what they mean is hands-on social ministry, but we also are engaged in global compassion ministry as well as global cross-cultural evangelism. So that's kind of who we are as our strengths. one of the things that we've been doing in the past 3 years, especially with adult discipleship, is asking ourselves, how do we come up against that in a complementary way? I think prior to that, we've been beating our heads against the brick wall, trying to sort of brute force a church that's strength is evangelism and missions and children's ministry into a discipleship church. And it was always kind of not working. So we said, what does it mean to actually go with our strengths rather than fight them? And that actually, strangely enough, started working. So let me talk a little bit about the core concepts that we developed that then also take advantage of the congregation's strengths. Number one, we believe discipleship is an ongoing journey, as you can see on the document. And that means that from cradle to grave, we continue to grow, and that a healthy disciple is one who is a constant learner. We rely a bit on Robert Clinton's model for this, if you're familiar with The Making of a Leader by Robert Clinton. And we also rely a bit on Janet Hagberg's book, The Critical Journey, if you want to know some of the sort of research horsepower behind our thinking. So we believe that discipleship is an ongoing journey. We also believe it's an organic journey. In other words, God uses circumstances, relationships, and events to shape us for our benefit and His purposes. And so our job is to greenhouse that. And in other words, we cannot program people into discipleship, nor can we guilt people or shame people or all the other tools that sometimes the church uses. But what we can do is create a hothouse situation, or a very catalytic situation where the Spirit and disciple can basically, where God begins to do amazing things. And that involves several things. One is multiple on-ramps into discipleship experience, simple pathways where people don't have to play hide and go seek, where we also aren't making it difficult for people to access things. Also, where we do a lot of connection with other parts of the church, so that if you enter in through the mission side of our congregation, that it's easy to get into discipleship and vice versa. Also, that I'll touch on that later, but then also that we believe discipleship is transformative, so that discipleship isn't simply about learning a bunch of doctrine, and discipleship isn't just about a lot of activism, but discipleship is about a transformation of the inner person, and as that happens, that we see that in a change in both outlook and behavior. Finally, discipleship is holistic. Actually, one more after that, which involves in the emotional, physical, and relational aspects of a human being. And so in that way, we want to help people develop different habits, different life habits, and a lot of that has to do with things like spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices. But we want to do it, again, in an organic way, where we're not sort of smashing a set of spiritual practices on top of a person in a way that doesn't make any sense. And always we want to teach in our program with always a bias towards application, so that things aren't just hanging 15 feet in the air, which is an easy thing to do with Bible studies, where we don't ask the question, what's the point? And then finally, discipleship is an outward journey. There's sort of two problems that happen, I think, in discipleship that we try to avoid. Number one is that discipleship is nothing more than a self-help program. And frankly, that's already happened, and that's called the Pharisees. And that's where you basically have no outflow. And when you have no outflow in a body of water, you get stagnation, and you get algae, and it starts stinking. Well, the same thing happens with Christians when there's no outflow. Or the other one is where outflow is simply what we call feed the beast, where discipleship is simply volunteering to keep the mechanism of the congregation going. And while that's important, it's still not the point. So we want to make sure that people understand that the discipleship is being equipped to bring Christ into their natural context, their neighborhood, their place of work. And if they're also so moved into city transformation, global transformation, you name it, but that just this discipleship cycle is not complete until we start being Christ to our neighbor. So that's kind of a quick overview of the core practices that drive us.
Thanks, Richard. And Mary, I think you're going to tell us a little bit about how you've applied this in women's ministry over 5 years, correct?
That's right. Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. Well, I had the pleasure of working with Richard for the past 5 years, and I've learned so much about discipleship from him. And I'd like to tell you the story of one ministry within Lutheran Church of Hope's discipleship team, within the context of Hope's overall discipleship. And I promise you, I don't have all the answers, but my prayer is that there is at least one idea, one aha moment, one affirmation for you that you can take away in leading your team. The story begins 5 years ago. I had been in newspaper publishing for 25 years, had left that world and had joined a venture that focused on women's leadership. And Hope came to me and recruited me as the women's ministry director. And I came in at a time that was kind of unusual. The previous director of the ministry had been ill for a long time, and she had passed away. And so there was a lot of mourning and grieving going on when I came on board. And I came from a business world where everything is judged by numbers. So it's how many newspapers you sell, how many readers you have. And so I walked into this role thinking that's what it was all about. It was just about the numbers, like how many people were coming to classes, how many tickets that we sold to that event. And God was just so gentle with me. And I realized, well, that's not working. And so he laid a lot of things on my heart, and I just want to share those with you in building a ministry within a discipling culture. And the first thing that he did for me was he laid on my heart that I didn't have to have all the answers, and that I needed to be a detective of divinity. I needed to really stop and watch and listen and observe what was going on in these women's lives when they walked in the doors of our church. And I wasn't a stalker, but I literally stood at the door of the church and watched them come in. I asked the teachers, could I come into your classes and observe what's going on? And within that time of observing, I noticed that there was just a lot of heaviness. And so God laid on my heart a mission. And that mission was within the context of Hope's overall mission. And that mission was to renew and restore the women of Hope. And that mission allowed us, every time an idea came in, like, hey, Mary, God's told me we need to do this class. Well, okay, let's look at that within the context of this mission. And any idea that we had, we put it through this mission, and it allowed us to filter all the ideas to get to the core of what he was trying to do in women's ministry. The third thing he did was so funny because he gently showed me, I thought, okay, we need to have teams, okay? Let's have a team for events and a team for classes and a team for curriculum, and we'll have a team and I'll pick the leader and then all those leaders will report to me. No, that didn't work. And so he gently said, no. This is relational. You need to get to the core of who these women are, understand who they are. And I am kind of a strength finders geek. There's a million tools out there. You may have spiritual assessment tools that you really like at your church. Myers-Briggs is awesome. The reason why I like Strength Finders, which is by Tom Rath, is that it's very affordable. It costs like $20 a book. And it's very easy. You go online, you take the test, in 30 minutes, you know what your top 5 strengths are. So the first thing I did was I with all the women that were currently leading, I asked them, invited them to come to a Strength Finders workshop. And then in that workshop, we not only talked about what their strengths were, but we talked about how God personally wired each of them, how that was showing up in their professional and their personal life. How do they attract things that give them strength and let go of the things that are depleting them? And how do these strengths show up on a team? And it was life-giving to these women. For many of them, they had never understood. They thought, oh, my pastor's the leader. I'm not a leader. They couldn't see how these awesome gifts that God had given to them actually were allowing them to lead others. They understood the concept of influence, but they didn't understand that that was really about leading. And once we work with a core team of leaders, then I said, I want you to identify people that you see have great potential in the kingdom of God. And so we started inviting others into these workshops. And when it was all said and done, we've probably done, I think, at least over 200 women have been trained in strength finders. And it's just like an army of women that was like just opened up the ways in which God had wired them to bring glory to the kingdom. So once we understood what their gifts were, we started to see, okay, were we aligning their gifts with the ways in which God was moving this ministry? And so in areas where we thought we were weaker, we went to people that we saw having those strengths and said, could you join us? And other areas we said, you're doing a fabulous job, just take it to the next step. Besides strength finders, the other thing that I think made a difference was pouring into these leaders relationally with one-on-one meetings. We had quarterly leadership meetings where we talked about leadership, not just in terms of what is leadership, but within the context of ministry. For example, women came to us that were leading and said, look, we need to understand what this line is. When a person comes to us, they're in a Bible study, they're really hurting. What is that line between walking alongside them or when they need professional help? What is that line? And what do we do? What are the steps that we take? So that's an example of something that you might find in ministry that you wouldn't find in another leadership position. And we really talked and poured into those areas where they really needed some help in ministry. We were always on the lookout for new leaders, bringing them in. And something really simple, I'm sure you're doing this, but is to celebrate successes. That's handwritten notes. We have a coffee shop here at Hope. I mean, to give them a free drink ticket to say thank you, you would have thought I'd given them $1 million. But something that simple. And then something that was also really interesting to me is at Christmas time, we would have come to the church, we'll have coffee, we'll have, a pastry, we'll talk about how great the year was. Nobody showed up. So when I invited them to come to my home and the assistant in the ministry worked with me, we made the food, we decorated it, we talked about each of them and the fabulous things they had done that year. It was life-giving to these women because we were pouring into them. And the last thing that God laid on my heart was just love these women where they're at. They come to us at a point in their journey, just love them where they're at. And as my season was ending in ministry at Hope when I was retiring, and I was writing about this, I just had to chuckle because that's what Jesus came to do. And that's what I learned on my journey, was that Jesus came to restore us to the Father. Jesus came to be in intimate relationship with us. Jesus came to affirm our unique gifts for the glory of God. And Jesus just loves us where we're at. And so that was I just had to laugh out loud with that one. So on your resource page on the screen are books that were very helpful to me when I was building that ministry along with Richard and along with some incredible colleagues that I have and the women that I've had the great, great honor of leading. And they're all there, and I hope that they have meaning for you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. I want to basically widen the camera angle lens a little bit and talk about how that shows up in our entire ministry. And to do that, I want to kind of narrate back a little bit to where we started and how we began to learn to do things a little differently. You may have in your documents just something called the Hope Circle. If you don't worry about it, but like a lot of churches back in, I came in the year 2000, we were using something that looked suspiciously close to Rick Warren's baseball diamond, but because we're nice Iowans, we don't like angles, so we turn things into circles. But it had 4 areas. It had seeker, believer, follower, and servant leader, and it wasn't necessarily pointing to developmental milestones on a believer's life, as it was more assimilation behaviors within the life of the congregation. So a seeker was someone who was attending worship just a little bit, and then a believer was someone who was becoming a regular attender. A follower was one who was becoming a participant in classes and in various events and retreats, and a servant leader was someone who was fully involved in the congregation, and it was even volunteering a lot. So you can see it was more of a volunteerism model than a genuine discipleship model. Again, it seemed to work for us quite well at the time. Where it didn't work is when people were beginning to grow as a disciple, it didn't really describe their experience, nor did it help them with their next steps. So we began to rethink that over time, and about 5 years ago, we began to augment it. As we were rethinking it, our senior pastor, Mike Householder, said, if you don't like the symbol, you can go ahead and scratch it and start with a new one. And I and another colleague thought about that for a while and thought, well, it'd be great to just make a brand new growth symbol. But the only thing was that this symbol had been so deeply embedded in the life of the congregation that we thought that would just create more confusion than anything. So even though there might be some theological differences, for example, I think, we would all agree probably it's hard to be a follower and a believer and not be a follower. So that's a little bit tricky. But we decided still to go with it because that's what the congregation was used to seeing. So we unpacked it, and there you should have a document called the Hope Circle as Lifelong Journey. And so we interpreted these 4 stages more from a lifelong model than just simply a congregational participation model. So we have 3 sort of categories that occur within the Hope Circle, and again, understanding it as a development or a stage pathway. Number 1, throughout your life, you will be discovering God's story. Also, throughout your life, you'll be discovering your story in God's story. And then throughout your life, you'll grow in living out your story within God's story. So how does that start? Well, as a seeker, then you are beginning the journey through discovery. You're beginning to investigate who is God and what's He about. You're exploring God and His story, and then sooner or later you come to a crossroads. What are you going to do about this information? And hopefully, by the power of the Spirit, you will join God and His people in God's story. Even though we Lutherans often are very shy about making decisions, one way or another, you still have to fish or cut bait, and you can call it whatever you will. But usually God's Spirit will lead you to a point where you say yes. And when people have said yes, then they become believers. And at this point, you move into the next steps, which would be to begin to grow with God's people in God's story and to start to be discovering your own story. It's amazing how often people are completely illiterate about their own life story. And so one of the ways, I think one of the key discipleship moves people need to make is to become self-aware of who they are and where they've been. When that happens, they also begin to discover God in their story, and they begin to ask Psalm 22 questions and Psalm 13 questions, which are essentially, God, where were you in my pain? Where were you in my suffering, in my confusion? And often people don't know they have permission to ask these questions, but these are crucial questions developmentally to ask. This will often send them into a journey that is often be called the dark night of the soul, which I think is very necessary for disciple growth. And then at that point, obviously, they need people who can walk with them through that. As people negotiate that, then they move into being a follower. And this is where a big flip happens. Up till now, everything has been more or less about being a religious consumer. I discover God in my story. I am a follower of Jesus because it benefits me. Here, a flip occurs, and I discover not so much God in my story, but I discover my story in God's story. I discover I'm not the center of the universe, that the point of Christianity is not me or my self-improvement, but it is rather partnering with God and what He's up to. At that point, I begin to learn to live my story inside of God's grander narrative. And I find that my identity comes from Him rather than from achievement or other sorts of things that are insufficient to ground my identity. From there, we also start moving beyond ourselves as we help others begin to discover God's story. And that moves us then from follower to servant leader. And this is where it's an intensification of what we've learned as followers. We, at this point, are fully living our story in God's story. We're helping others discover and grow in God's story. And at this point, we are impacting the world around us with God's story. And of course, we've been doing all of those all along for a while, but at this point, everything's sort of in full bloom. So this is the way we unpacked the Hope Circle as a lifelong journey. At this point, we also begin to think, okay, if this is the model we're going to work with, then how as a discipleship team are we going to respond to that? And you should have a document called the Hope Circle Strategic Responses. And this is where we kind of looked at all of this, and I and another colleague designed this together. And wouldn't you know it, he's taking a call to a congregation in Atlanta. I know, we just keep driving them away. It's just awful. Well, Atlanta's the benefit for that, and I think he had a fiance who was down there. So, what can you do? But again, what we did is we put it together. In this case, in a sense of grids, where we looked at how was God at work in each of these 4 stages, and then what do disciples need in each of these 4 stages, and how, as ministry leaders in the adult discipleship team, can we respond? And again. We initially had all these programs that we listed, and that just got very cluttered, and we realized that was not the point. The point is actually in the response areas to list postures. So let me walk through just a couple, and I think that will just make the point. I don't think we need to walk through the whole document. So if we take a look at seeker, God is at work in our life story. God is at work revealing his presence to us, and ultimately moving us by the power of his Spirit to say yes to him. And in the growth context, this is pre-discipleship. And as disciples or as pre-disciples, we need some basic things. One is to know God in his story in the first place. We also need a welcoming and engaging environment, one that's safe for us to ask questions. And we need loving, healthy relationships. So as ministry leaders, what's our response to all those needs? And also, how do we partner with God in what he's already up to? Well, then our job is to embrace seekers in their journey through worship, community, learning, and service, and also already through relational mentoring. Who are the people who can come alongside in a non-judgmental, unconditional way and say, yes, we recognize your journey, and you can explore any aspect you want. You can ask any question. Nothing is offensive. Nothing is taboo, because our God can handle it. He's a big boy. He can take any kind of questioning. And then likewise, if we take a look at believer, as God is at work then revealing his story and our story, revealing his love and forgiveness, and then also revealing our true selves and our calling. And at this point, we're engaging both in interior and exterior growth. Then a disciple needs to be able to discover God's story in our story. And again, this has a lot of parallels with the pathway. They also need encouragement to explore and discover who they are in Christ. So there's going to be a lot of identity work going on. And then also life-giving spiritual practices. So how do we engage that as a team? Well, we engage believers with God's story through learning, service, and leadership opportunities. In other words, we want people to start leading fairly early on, because one of the best ways to cement in disciple learnings is to have people start leading. We know that with teaching, the best way for a teacher to learn is to teach the material. And again, once again, with relational mentoring and discovery-based coaching. And that's, at this point, we are just beginning to build a coaching network. And in fact, tomorrow and the next day, we have a 2-day coaching seminar for several of our staff and key volunteers to go through as we build that network. So that's just a little bit of how that grid works and how we're developing postures to help us respond to people as they walk through this developmental pathway.
Wow, Richard and Mary, you've given us a lot of good stuff there. You guys have been hard at it. And one of the things I really appreciated is how when you saw God was not using what you thought was needed, you stepped back, you listened, you tried something different, something much more relational, and how God used that. So we're going to open up the questions, but I thought a question I saw as I was going through this, Richard, when you were going from believer to follower, and you talked about that period of really wondering, and some authors call it the dark night of the soul. It gets so difficult. You mentioned the book, The Critical Journey. They call it The Wall. what are some practical things that you've done at Lutheran Church of Hope, or maybe in the women's ministries, to give people permission at that stage? You know, I mean, it's a confusing stage, because you're asking the questions you thought you had answered, you no longer feel answered, right? And a lot of times we say that's not good. But how did you both affirm it, but also help people through that wall? Do you have any examples you can remember over the years that might be good for us to think about?
Mary, do you want to answer that first?
Well, I think that there are two tools that are used not only in women's ministry but throughout adult discipleship. One of that is looking at your life's journey through the Post-it note exercise, where that actually started with the 3M stuff, I think, as I remember.
It's a combination. We use a timeline that both it comes from Tom Patterson, Leading the Life You've Always Wanted, and also out of Terry Walling's Leader Breakthrough. That's where we kind of got the idea from those two sources, where we basically use, through a series of Post-it notes on a board and some interpretive tools, we help people see how God has been in their life all along.
Yes.
Help them sense patterns of how God is working, what life lessons God might have been teaching them, and then from what God has done, what God is likely to keep doing as they move forward.
And to me, I think that tool has been so life-changing for so many people throughout all of our discipleship ministries, because you walk away with a sense of, I'm not crazy. This has happened before, and God has always been with me throughout that entire journey, and He is with me now. So that's very affirming for them. And a safe environment, a trusted environment where they know they're not going to be judged, that everyone has their own journey. And secondly, I would love for Richard to talk about, we have a ministry that really focuses in on the dark night of the soul, and Richard can speak to that.
We have a whole area called Purposeful Living that offers 6 learning experiences, 3 courses, and 3 retreats. And the 3 retreats get in at dealing with the wall at various age stages. Again, using Clinton as a model, he talks about the wall. He calls it boundary items. Mm-hmm. Not sure why but he has 3 that I think make sense. Awakening, for people who experience that in their 20s and 30s. Deciding, people who experience that in their 40s and 50s. And then finishing, people who experience that boundary item in their 60s and 70s. And we use 3 retreats over the course of to address that when people are going through that. And we run these retreats every semester. The first one deals with issues of identity and calling. In other words, how did God make you? And how has your past shaped you, and where God might be taking you? The second retreat deals with the issue of focus. What is the contribution that God is calling you to make, and how can you begin to say no to the good stuff so you can say yes to the right stuff? And it also helps you begin to learn about limits. It begins to help you accept limits and even leverage limits. And then the third one is about finishing well. How do you begin to hand on what God has given you? And how do you begin to become the mentor for someone else? And third, how do you basically knock the notion of retirement right out of your head? Because God ain't finished with you until you breathe your last. And then finally, how do you be in love with Christ more at your last breath than at your first, so that you become someone who is constantly developing all the way till Christ calls you home? So each one of those retreats is designed for people who are experiencing that in-between period, whether we call it the wall or we call it the dark night of the soul, and has helped people then to discern what's going on and then move forward.
Richard, you know that Bobby Clinton was my professor of my doctoral work as well, and those retreats, I'd love to look at them. They sound cool. And what Mary was describing too, as the from Terry Walling, I knew Terry 15 years ago, and we've written a curriculum called Charting a Course, which is a similar thing. It's just really powerful for people. So, what did you want to add, Richard?
Oh, those are Walling's retreats. We did not make them.
God, those from Walling. Yeah, he does great work.
Yep, and the first one is called Focus Living. The second one's called Apex, and the third one's called Resonance.
Okay.
So if you you can take a look at them on the Leader Breakthrough website.
Leaderbreakthrough.com.org?
.com, I believe.
Okay, great, good resource. Well, hey, let's open this up to some of the other DiscipleOn participants. Because there's so many of us, I can't see all at once, so if somebody raise their hand, you got to give me a couple minutes to scroll through the pictures, but somebody have a question they'd like to lead off with.
I have one, but I don't remember how to raise my hand on this.
That's all right.
So
Go
I'm
for it,
just
Kathy.
Jump
Jump away.
Richard, I was listening to the last portion of what you're implementing at Hope, and I'm really curious about this counseling, what did you call it, coaching network. And part of the reason for that is that I'm trying to establish, as part of my commissioning and residency from June for the next 2 years, to incorporate a Stephen Ministries-like concept with discipleship. And it sounds like that's very similar to what I'm trying. So I'm interested in hearing what that's all about.
We have a Stephen's Ministry-like ministry here called One-to-One. And what we've kind of looked at, just conceptually, I've kind of created a grid for people who are kind of going through a rough patch. We would use one-to-one, and then where coaching fits in is more moving genuinely healthy people forward. And again, this is really where it gets squishy, because when we're dealing with someone who's hitting the wall, they can often look like they're unhealthy, and often we don't know what we're dealing with until we kind of wade in the waters with people, and we're still kind of ironing that out. Right now, where we are in the stage is we are still building up our network and infrastructure, and we're trying to create sort of various ways of helping people move from one area to another in a way that's scalable for our congregation. So we have a document called a compass that is a self-administered assessment that then we have. We're trying to train people in some of our larger classes that use small group processing, where that they can come alongside people who've used the compass and kind of coach them. And that kind of coach training is simply training those people in active listening, where, and so that in that way, that coaching moment may mean nothing more than 10 to 15 minutes, is where they sit down with someone with the compass assessment sheet and kind of listen to what their story is and then help them think about their next steps. In fact, we call it a next steps conversation. And then going more deeply, where we're kind of at this point in the development area is trying to make available both mentors and coaches for people who need larger conversations, half-hour conversations, where they would schedule them and maybe meet once a month, or maybe to get it off the ground, twice a month initially. And we differentiate between mentors and coaches, that the mentor relationship is going to be more where someone is putting in, almost like a discipling relationship, helping them acquire spiritual disciplines, helping them grow in the knowledge of Scripture and prayer, and also in missional living. Where a coach would be more for someone who's already kind of acquired that, and the coach simply pulls out what's already God has already put in there, and helps them then discern where they're going. And I don't know, does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You bet.
That sheet you said, Richard, about the post-alpha next step compass is what the title of the sheet. So you use that post-alpha program?
We use it post-alpha, and we also use it with another course called Core, that has it's formatted very similar to Alpha. And at the end of Core, people also filled out the next steps. Our goal is at the end of any, what I guess I'd call a milestones course or a milestones retreat, that the participants would fill out the compass to help them move forward, so that that courses are not taken in isolation, but courses are part of a larger disciple journey.
I'd like to add to that. I think one of the many things that Richard did in leading the discipleship team, when I came on board prior to him leading the team, the ministries, adult ministries, were very siloed. So there was men's and women's and singles and married, and they were very siloed. And when they're siloed like that, everyone's competing for resources, and there isn't as much teamwork or communication going on. Richard really changed the culture of the team. And so now when there's someone, it doesn't matter what ministry that they're in, when they're saying what's next, the coaches who have been trained in all of those ministries are trained in having those conversations, and they know what's being offered across all the ministries. So if someone says, here's where I'm at, I've taken this, this, and this, but I feel like God's calling me here, what would that look like at Hope? They have the ability then to say, oh, not only within our own team, but to say, perhaps you're ready to go on this mission trip, or perhaps you're ready to be trained to help someone who's going through a divorce, or maybe you really want to pour into children at this point in time. So that's really changed the entire culture, not only of our team, but I think of the church itself.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm sure there'll probably be some questions that will come in about that siloing, because that happens so much in churches.
Yeah.
It's really easy.
It is. But Richard, you talked a little bit about Alpha, and Dan Akins had asked a really good question. Maybe Dan, you could ask that here about Alpha and its relationship with discipleship and evagelism. Dan, you remember that question? Could you offer that up here?
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. I just got hired to run Alpha here at the church. Just changing roles within the church, and I haven't really even started yet. So, but one of the first things that I've noticed is while I talk about Alpha and really trying to communicate it as an evangelism tool that really moves people from unbelief to belief, people have the idea that really more it's to kind of retrain or to grow the congregation in like basics of Christianity, and which I'm sure that will happen to some extent, but that's not the goal that we want. We want Alpha to be moving people from unbelief to belief. And so one thing I was just going to ask you guys, how do you help communicate? I guess you talk about postures at each stage. How do you help communicate that your programs that you do for evangelism or whatever are meeting those postures versus other ones?
Mm-hmm. Would you like me to speak directly to Alpha?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. It's interesting that the research that Alpha has done itself has discovered that the beginning stages of any Alpha program, typically the congregation itself goes through it. So I'm not surprised that your congregation thinks the first thing it should be is a refresher course. In fact, that's normal.
Okay.
And I'm not so sure I would fight that too much.
Okay.
And one of the things it does is it can spark a bit of a revival in your congregation.
Very much so.
Because remember, the way Alpha is designed is not just information, but it's about transformation. Especially with the Holy Spirit retreat, or I think now it's called a weekend away. But once your congregation's been saturated, that's the point where you can challenge your congregation. Okay, you've been through Alpha. Now go get some friends, and now you take Alpha with your friend. And that way you have a relational evangelism, because they can actually create safe space by saying, "Hey, come take Alpha with me." And that way it isn't like you have a whole bunch of people who are just awkwardly sitting in an Alpha program who don't know each other, aren't quite sure they are buying into this Jesus thing in the first place. That would be a tricky atmosphere. One of the things I would also say is our Alpha director would love to have a conversation with you. That's one of the things she does here in Iowa is she often coaches other Alpha churches in the state. So just if you want to, just give us a call and she'd be happy to have a conversation with you.
That would be awesome. Cool.
I'm trying to think of other things. One of the ways Alpha functions in our congregation is it's kind of our de facto membership course. Alpha is so flexible that after you've done it a while, it will sort of take on the DNA of your congregation. So if you're Baptist, it'll start looking Baptist. If you're Lutheran, it starts looking Lutheran. If you're Anglican, it starts looking Anglican. And they designed it that way. So I remember we tweaked it a little bit in some spots, and we had our directors were actually in England at Holy Trinity Brompton, and they very, very timidly said, "Oh, we tweaked this here and we tweaked that there. Is that okay?" And they said in typical British fashion, "Fantastic, brilliant," So, the one thing I would say though is the way they program it with a large group, small group, and the meal. Don't mess with that stuff. We messed with it earlier on and almost broke Alpha. So we had to start it all over again. Doing it the way they said. They know what they're talking about.
That's great. Thanks.
Another illustration of what Richard said, I know a church that has done Alpha for 15 years regularly, and they've told me that over 50% of their membership now came in through Alpha. Mm-hmm. So, Richard, I think you called that the seeker phase. In Jesus' invitation, we call it the come and see phase, where Alpha can be a huge help there.
Huge.
So,
yeah.
Thanks.
Dan,
somebody else? Go ahead.
The contact person who runs Alpha is Melissa Matthews.
So if Dan just called Lutheran Church of Hope, their number, and asked for Melissa Matthews, you can get through to her.
Yes.
Yeah. How about somebody else? I know this is not a shy group, and since I'm having a hard time seeing in a couple minutes, so any questions, unmute yourself, and we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, one of the things that one of the things that we've been exploring in our congregation is just what we're offering to help people move from that in that early stage of faith in Christ to growth. And I've noticed that you all have used the Apprentice series that comes out of Renovare or James Bryan Smith, taking some of Dallas Willard's ideas on spiritual formation into a congregation. And how have you executed that in your congregation, and what's the impact been?
We've executed it a couple ways. We initially tried to do it with lectures and small group process, but we abandoned that, and we're doing it more in small group ways. We have it two ways. One is we will resource a small group. Where a small group says we want to do the Apprentice series, we basically will help them get going like that. Or the other way we will do it is we will do it in a class format, but there's no lecture. In other words, it's almost as if we'll form groups, and you simply meet in the room with groups. It's almost like creating groups in a formal way. It sort of ensures that the group will go all the way through the whole book. When I talk to people who've taken it, they find it very transformative. One of the I'm trying to think of other things about it.
Well, if I can add to that. One of the things that we looked at was where it fits on the discipleship path. And at first we thought, okay, the natural step for a seeker is to take Alpha. When they come out of Alpha, what's next? And we originally thought, okay, there's a curriculum that we have called Core, and we thought, okay, Core is next. Actually, what we figured out was Apprentice is great following Alpha, because Alpha is just like the building blocks of what you believe, but then the Apprentice series really opens up, why do I believe what I believe? What is Jesus actually saying in the Bible? What are those very basic spiritual disciplines that will help me on my growth path? So it really became almost, we always believe it's not a specific pathway. Every person's different, but we did find that Apprentice was a very natural thing to follow the original right after Alpha. The other thing I think that we have a volunteer who actually leads that ministry, and they've done a really nice job of identifying people who are taking the class early on to see if in fact they would be a facilitator the next time around, and that's how they've built their team of volunteers.
Let me add one thing there, is that Apprentice series sort of gets at your worldview and at your sense of who God is and who you are. And then core is more action-oriented. So depending upon kind of how you're wired, you may do alpha core apprentice series, or you may do alpha apprentice series core. But it's, if I were to use an older word, those three classes form as a cluster kind of a basic catechism. So then you sort of have the basics of the faith down, but not just what you believe, but how you act.
Good, thanks.
Thank you. It's really helpful.
Yeah.
Somebody else? Any other questions?
So as it relates to the Alpha Apprentice Core, et cetera, I have to believe that you are familiar with the Methodist Church and the Disciples program and the Christian Believer and that concept, or those lessons.
Yes, I know the Disciples program. I don't know the others though.
Well, so I'm asking, is Alpha different from Disciples? Because Disciples is like a Bible study. Alpha is more what?
Alpha is more introducing you to Jesus and the Christian way. If I understand the Disciples, it's actually more work. The bar is higher, and as a result, there's more transformation. It's funny you'd ask. I actually read an academic article on it where someone did research on where they did action research on it, and they were blown away at the transformative power of the Disciples program. So, I've not experienced it firsthand, but if that research article was all correct, that sounds like a fantastic program.
It is a fantastic program. It's just that the Disciples program itself is 32 weeks with significant work in between. They've moved and formed a Disciples Fast Track that breaks it into 2 12-week sessions, but I'm not sure that has been as transformative as the longer one.
Alpha is much more relational than the Disciple Track.
That's good to hear. That's what I'm looking for. So, okay.
And is Alpha not more for introducing people to Christ with, as Richard was saying, core theology, and Disciple is more about going deeper once you've come to believe? Is that a good comparison of the two?
That's the Christian Believer. Disciple is strictly understanding the Bible.
Okay, understanding the Bible.
And so that's why it's so intensive. You're reading through the entire Bible.
The assumption is that you're already a believer, where that's not the assumption in Alpha, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, Richard, I just have a quick question, and I see Bob has his hand up as well. Somebody asked, what are the statistics regarding Lutheran Church of Hope? How many members? What's your proportion in each age range, which I'm not sure specifically what they're referring to in terms of age range. And what's your diversity in your congregation?
Oh, interesting questions. I think our actual membership is around 20,000. And our attendance is 12,000. And for mainliners, that's good. If we were evangelicals, it would be not so good. Our average age is around age 36. And demographically, our main campus sits in wealthy western suburbs, and we are actually more diverse than our demographics surrounding us. We are increasingly getting more and more African Americans, which is we're welcoming pretty soon. That's going to hit a tipping point where we're going to have to make some decisions about what our staffing looks like, because we have to represent the people who are in our congregation. Our downtown congregation is the attendance is 1/3 homeless, and there are homeless even in the leadership of that congregation. Then our other other 3 campuses are all in the suburbs. I'm not sure about their demographics. The newest campus is going to be in a university town where ISU is, so that's probably going to be half students. Trying to think of anything. Am I giving you the demographic you're looking for?
Yeah, it didn't give specifics in the question, but you're doing great. Thank you.
Okay, you bet. I'm trying to think, is there anything, Mary, that you would add to that?
it's a young, I always perceive it as a young congregation, and I think our senior pastor has a great passion for children's ministry. And a lot of times he talks about, bringing the children in, and the parents and the families will follow. Our VBS now has 6,000.
Our last VBS was actually 8,000.
8,000 in over a well, actually 2-week period, but in one of those sessions, it's both morning and evening. So, and we have a really robust moms ministry too, to really help serve the needs of those young families.
Well, those numbers kind of blow some of us away. We're just like, wow, that's huge. Did Ken say that Bob had a question?
Yes. My question, Mike and Richard and Kathy, sorry, Mary and Richard, concerns. So we're located in Houston, and we have about 4 campuses. And my question is how you implemented awareness in the congregation of the stages of discipleship, and particularly doing that in a multi-campus setting.
Very interesting question. We have not implemented the awareness of it. And again, part of that is because we're an evangelistically oriented congregation. The way we have treated the stages is more to act. In other words, the stages function more on how we serve the congregation, not as a paradigm that we've taught the congregation.
Yeah.
So then, do you share the stages of the congregation? So if I was an active attender at Lutheran Church of Hope over a couple of years, would I be hearing this language? Would I understand what it meant, or is it kind of behind the scenes type stuff?
It's behind the scenes.
Okay. Good.
And where you would become aware of a sense of development by the way through the class experiences, through the invitation for someone to walk alongside you. If you went to either any of the 3 retreats or any of the classes that are paired with those 3 retreats, you would have a sense, oh my goodness, there's classes for me to make sense of my life journey. That's how that would work.
So you're talking about the need, just approach it by the need.
Yeah.
And
I
can say that we actively train our leaders on how to speak about inviting others in. So they have tools on understanding, because we know that the most powerful ways to grow and bring more people in is through a personal invitation.
Yeah.
And so we talk to them about the different avenues that they can do that. That's not scary to a person when they first start, and then the tools to invite others in. So it's more stealth.
That makes me think of another question. So you talked about there are different disciple needs at each of these stages. And let's imagine you've got another campus, and some of the leadership there says, everybody has the same discipleship need. It's just one discipleship need for everybody. And that's what we're going to talk about here. So what do you do with someone like that who just says, yeah, just on the same page as you are, and yet you're trying to move this forward?
It's interesting that you'd mentioned that. We've actually had that where people have looked at what we've done and go, too complicated. We'll just go real simple. We'll just offer this one thing. Usually what happens is real life just hits like a Mack truck sooner or later. Sometimes the leader, him or herself, goes through a life stage and goes, oh, I see what you're talking about. Or some of their key leaders start going through these life stages. And they begin to realize that they don't have the tools to make sense of what their congregation is experiencing. Then what happens is they bang on our doors and say, can we have a conversation? In fact, a lot of the things, it's very interesting. I know Mary and I have we've noticed throughout our 5 years that we've introduced concepts that initially have been resisted, and the next thing you know, they're being talked about by everybody. And
when that happens, Richard, you don't say, hey, guys, remember, I'm the first one who told you that. You just say, hey, that's a good idea, right?
That's right. Yes, that's an excellent idea. How can we come alongside and help you with that? Good.
Well, what else are you going to add, Richard? You had something else there you're talking about.
Go ahead, Mary.
I was also going to add that from like a ministry standpoint, we would have our quarterly leadership meetings, and also we have something called Equip, which is also church-wide, campus-wide leadership development that we are always inviting at the grassroots level in the ministry. So we're always saying, hey, if you want to come for this training program, or if you want to be a part of this experience, you're always welcome. So what happens sometimes is the people that are on the ground level want that, and so they will come in and participate, and then they will go back to their campus and say, hey, I just learned something great, it went out, blah, 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 blah. And so sometimes you just kind of have to keep inviting them in at the ground level before it sometimes gets to the top levels.
Yeah. The other is that I coach about 5 staff members, basically developmental coaching as they grow as leaders. And that's another way I get the DNA out, is I'm inculcating that in just the way I'm being with them. And then that influences their ministry areas.
It sounds like you're doing a lot of things well. Hey, I want to remind our visitors, our guests, that they can ask questions on that chat feature on the bottom of the screen, and we'll get them to Richard and Mary. So I just want to remind you all who are watching that you can ask a variety of questions. Who else has a question of Richard and Mary?
If it's all right. Mary, when you began introducing, you mentioned helping your mentors to know the line between walking alongside and professional help. And I just wondered if you would speak to that a little more specifically.
Richard always says that we are a hospital for souls, and sometimes we're in the emergency room. And as I think our world becomes more and more complex, and personally think there's less funding for mental health issues in our culture, that we as a church are going to start seeing people who are deeply in need. And so we have a care staff at Hope who is well trained in mental health issues, and we also have a program called Celebrate Recovery, which is on Thursday nights. Many of you have those at your church. So we do have some resources here at the church. I think there's probably only like 5 full-time people on that staff. They do an amazing job with an army of volunteers. But we invited the director of that department to come in to talk to our leaders. And she brought in a lot of materials from mental health alliances. And we could talk about what are the signs of a mental breakdown, of what are the signs where a person is highly agitated and may move into a very dangerous situation to harm themselves or others. What does that look like? So they were really trained on mental health issues. And I would say if you don't have that at your church, there's certainly nonprofits in the community that would love to be able to come in and train your volunteers on that. And it was presented in a very succinct form so that they literally had cards that they could actually take with them. It was very, very helpful for them to understand what those signs were. And so there was that component of it, and then there was a prayer component of it also. So I hope that answers your question.
Mary, you may like to know that Tim is a discipleship staff at a church on a reservation, and he started Celebrate Recovery, and it's going really well there as an entry point into their discipleship program.
Very cool.
That is, good work. That's great.
Anything more you want to ask Tim as a follow-up, or is that good?
Yeah, that's pretty good. I mean, the Celebrate has its ups and downs as we're implementing, but yeah, we're trying to get people to grow in that accountability relationships, while we also are recognizing we're not professional help, but we're directing people to Christ and to His Spirit as our counselors. So, yeah.
Well, I would hope that encourage you to look for those partnerships and alliances professionally that can really help you when things tip over to a different stage, and that you can get them the help that they need.
Yeah.
really great work.
This is great. Anybody else have another question?
The matrix that you showed a little bit earlier, is that something that you actually show your leadership and train them, looking at how to identify the stages and the journey that people are on? Or is also a lot of your leadership development, that part is behind the scenes, but you're teaching it without showing them very specific information like that matrix?
So far, that matrix is just what the staff knows.
Mm-hmm.
It's something I hadn't thought about teaching it also to the volunteers. I think that could be done. Right now, it's all implicit, but I think you could make it explicit. Again, Mary mentioned equip. One of our staff members, his specialty is leadership development, and that would be something that could be done at one of those equip days, where the whole day is dedicated to helping volunteers understand how Christians grow. Again, we are not doing that, but just as you talk about that, that's something that could be done.
Richard,
question
concern
about coaching. You have resources that you recommend as you equip coaches?
There's all kinds of really good coaching agencies. We happen to be using Leader Breakthrough, and I am a certified coach through Leader Breakthrough, and that allows me to teach their what they call their 2-day coach training program. In fact, that's what I'm going to be doing starting tomorrow. They also offer a 4-day coach training in which then you're certified by them. They are also an ICF certified trainer agency, if you're interested in that, International Coaching Federation. I think also, was it Church Resource Ministry also does coaching. Guy also named Keith Webb does a great job with coach training. So there's a lot of good stuff out there. Leader Breakthrough just happens to be what we use. And we're very satisfied by it. Terry Walling's pedagogical strategy, I just happen to like it. I think not everybody needs to be coach trained. I initially was drinking the Kool-Aid that said everybody needed to be coach trained. We are sort of thinking of a certain level requires coach training, but then another level, basically they just need to be able to engage in active listening. So we're designing half-day seminars for active listening that will probably get implemented next year. And that would we would run our alpha hosts through active listening seminars, as well as our apprentice leaders and also our core small group leaders. And so those are where we see that kind of training happening.
I can just say as a ministry leader that Terry Walling's material was really helpful, because I think the concepts are big enough to have impact, but small enough that a volunteer can wrap their brain around it and actually use it, not only in ministry, but many of them tell me they use it in their families.
Mm-hmm. That's very cool. I didn't realize that. That's excellent.
Yeah, Richard, you mentioned earlier this whole idea of, rather than focusing on programs, looking at postures. Mm-hmm. Can you unpack that a little bit more? And I don't know if that would want us to go back to your slide on your matrix, but I'm curious about the challenge you had around programming and the clutter that you felt, and many of us feel the same thing. So how do we kind of lift the postures and describe maybe what the postures are and how you try to put focus around those, and then let the programs follow?
Yeah. As I begin to read a lot of the literature on discipleship, it fell roughly into two categories. One is, worship the program will save you. And the other side of it was how I hate the megachurch. And I happened to be in a megachurch, so that wasn't very helpful. And usually that stuff was all where they said that, the salvation of the world is in the house church. you know. And so you had these two extremes where you either were bowing down to the program or you were bowing down to the one-on-one relationship. And I began to think, this is really nuts. So I started looking at it and realized that programs are not the enemy, but programs are also not the savior. So we have to kind of back up one level and say, the problem with all these, sort of forced options is they're not thinking strategically. And there's some prior questions that need to be asked before we even think about what we do. And that led me to start thinking about postures. Because if we engage in postures, then we realize that program can be a solution for a specific problem or a specific context. One-on-one is a response to another context. And sometimes you even pair them up in certain ways. And again, Alpha is a great example because it's, you can run an Alpha session with 400 people, but you then break them down into groups of 6 to 10. So it becomes a highly relational experience, even though you're running 400 people through it. And so we actually use that oscillation of large group, small group a lot in the way we do coursework, where we want to run a lot of people through an experience. But we also know that the further people grow, the less that classes make sense to them. So we don't expect people who are moving through follower and servant leader to be taking a ton of classes. They're going to, at that point, become self-learners. And what they're going to need more are relational networks and people who can address very specific issues and questions that they're experiencing. That was a new thing for me because, I was the guy for whom I had a class solution for everything. So never mind, you'd been walking with Christ for 30 years and you had processed your life. I had a class for you, and I wanted, and I was like, well, why don't you want to take this class? And it's like, well, because they kind of been there, done that. When I should have been asking different questions of, tell me where you are and where's your itch, So in that way, you really have to ask a whole lot of questions of someone before you respond, ergo posture.
If I can also add to that, when I was talking about being from a world where we only looked at numbers, but I also came from a world where we told stories. And so one of the ways that I could capture what was really happening in a classroom were the stories of transformation. And if you could not tell me any stories of transformation, I kind of would start to go, well, let's look at that. And literally as a leadership group, once a year, we would look at what do we need to start? What do we need to stop? What do we need to continue? And it was in a trusting environment, so they didn't feel like, oh, Mary's going to come in and chop that program off. But it was like, when you start talking about we would always talk about head, hearts, hands. So within your ministry area, where are you moving their head, their heart, their hands? And we have a lot of people who get kind of stuck in just Bible study. That's what they want, is Bible study. That's great. That's awesome. We have one group that has 250 women coming every Tuesday morning. That's what they want. But for other people, we would just have a seminar on a Friday night and a Saturday morning on how to learn to read the Bible. You can do that on your own. Let's move you towards more transformation.
Yeah.
Here's some, so often when I talk to churches, to people that are in chairs like you're not the lead pastor, sometimes there's a sense of frustration that, okay, we want this developmental model, but the lead pastor just doesn't see that. Have you experienced that kind of thing, and how have you responded to that, and how have you dealt with those situations?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that. Our pastor is a very concrete thinker. He's brilliant, but he's not an abstract thinker. And so initially I would pitch these concepts to him and he would just glaze. And I would interpret that as that he didn't care or that he didn't want it. And so I would butt heads with him and I kept wondering, well, why doesn't he, why isn't he interested? Why doesn't he care? Until one day, I was trying to argue for this, and he just looked at me and said, Richard, I just don't understand you. And I thought he was being frustrated, and I began to apologize because I was saying, I don't mean to be insubordinate. He says, no, it's not that. I literally do not understand you. And I, had the good sense to ask a question. And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You're too abstract." So I began to ask, well, what's his love language, or what's his strength language? And so as I begin to basically tell stories or give concrete instances of what this looks like, then he began to understand it. The other thing I begin to also realize is that if I could show how this made sense to his priorities, in other words, if this would support his evangelistic passions, and that makes sense. Any healthy discipleship strategy has to lead to an outward bound movement, which is inherently evangelistic. And otherwise it's not a biblical discipleship strategy. And so I begin to articulate that, and all of a sudden I had his attention. And at this point, I basically have the credit card.
Hope you don't abuse that credit card. I'm sure you don't.
No, well, and you joke about that, but in all seriousness, I have the responsibility to continue to support his evangelistic gifting and passions, because if I start taking that for granted, then we go back to step one. So it's up to me to honor that.
Thank you. That's good. It's good. Well, somebody else, you like to follow up on that question or ask any other questions?
That is a good question. I know we don't like to talk about finances, but on these retreats, on some of the longer type programs, how do you offset that, the cost of that from the church?
I'll speak, and Mary, if you want to add as well. It depends on what it is. I believe the 3 retreats I talked about earlier, I think they cost $25. There's the workbook that goes for like $10, and then there's the food. In a lot of ways, and then we have 2 philosophies. One is we want to make sure that nobody is prohibited from attending due to cost. So if someone can't afford it, we make sure they can get there anyways. So that's the bottom line for us. On the other hand, because we live in upper middle class suburbia, we also know if there's no skin in the game, then they're not going to take the thing seriously. So we're always working with that tension of making sure that nobody is kept out of an event because of economic reasons, but at the same time, people, have some skin in the game. Most of our stuff doesn't cost a lot. When there is a cost, usually it's the food they're paying for. A lot of it is because we develop our own materials, and that's an in-house thing, and so that keeps things cheap. Mary, can you speak of that from the women's ministry standpoint?
Absolutely. Within our budget, we have, remember when I was talking about entry points, that you need entry points in that aren't scary? We created 2 entry points. One is a Christmas brunch, and one is a spring brunch for in women's ministry. And the cost is $12. And for $12, they get a great buffet, and they get a professional speaker and really great music. It's a 2-hour program. And we actually make money on those events. And that really becomes part of our budget to be able to then invest in new resources, perhaps new curriculum that's being developed. But those money makers have actually helped fund other things within the ministry, and they fund a mother's worship service that we have every month just for moms, and that helps fund that too.
Great. Other questions? I saw Fred Tao had posted a question earlier, and I think you got that a bit, Richard, but those people that are in that 4th stage, you call it the servant leadership stage, they don't need classes so much. And how do you keep those people growing, keep them from getting stuck or plateaued? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think a couple things. Lots of coffee. And that, I would say that staff and high-level volunteers are shepherding them. They are also not that we are drinking coffee with them, but they are drinking coffee with others, so to speak. So making sure they are actively engaged in pouring themselves into others. And so in a lot of ways, we're monitoring them to see that their cup is being filled through serving. Most of them are in small groups, and these small groups are not the ones that meet once a month for just talking about the weather. A lot of these groups meet weekly and are engaged in deep Bible study on their own. So there's a lot of self-learning going on, and our job is just to make sure that, I don't know if you'd call it monitoring, because we're not really supervising them, but we're just making sure that everything is moving forward. And if somebody's getting stuck, then we're able to just be there for them if that occurs.
I would add to that with what I consider senior volunteers that have been doing this for quite a while, they still need encouragement. A lot of times they feel like I'm not relevant anymore, or am I relevant? And so a lot of it is having those coaching conversations with them about how they continue to grow and to encourage them that they're doing a great job. But I love to have the conversation with them about legacy. What is the legacy they want to leave? And that conversation takes them to a different level, and they start realizing, okay, I've been serving. When is that season going to end? And before it ends, I want to make sure that that's my legacy when I walk out one day.
Mary and Richard, we only have a couple minutes left, and you may have already said it, but is there anything especially that's on your heart that you think others who are seeking to grow disciples in their congregations, and it's not easy work, you've been at it for a long time, anything else that you'd like to say, or any questions that you have of others?
I would just I have one other thing to add, and that is on the resource that I had turned into you, one of my favorite books is Ruth Haley Barton's book, Strengthening the Soul of the Leader. I think all of us in discipling leadership have the potential to burn out. And that's the last thing I ever want to happen to anyone who is in that leadership position. And this book was a game changer for me in terms of understanding some spiritual disciplines that I needed to put in place. And then the awesome thing was I had suggested to Richard that as a team, we read it and discuss it. And Richard's is amazing teaching leader, and he said absolutely. And so as a team, we read that book and discussed a chapter every week. And as a team, I think it allowed us to be really authentic with each other, to talk about the struggles that we have as leaders and ways in which we could really support each other. And so I highly recommend that book.
It is an excellent book. Very good book. And you want to add, Richard?
Yeah, I would say,
I'm sorry, the author's name is Ruth Haley Barton, Barton. She also blogs, and she's just an awesome author.
Yeah,
Katie just put it up there for you all to see on Amazon. Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership. It's a very good book.
Yeah, highly recommended. I would say the one thing is, as you're building discipleship, I am kind of shocked, both in mainline and evangelical circles, how little people now know of Scripture. And you cannot build discipleship unless you have as a foundation the story of God and His people. Yes. And for me, biblical literacy is not just packing people with all kinds of information from the Bible, as interesting as that may be. It's getting people literate in the story of God, so that they can find themselves in that story. And again, to me, that's foundational.
No doubt. Yes, it is. It's very foundational. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. We want to just, I'm going to share a moment. One more thing we want to give everybody before we sign off. And that is to tell you that this is part of DiscipleOn. Can everybody see that, what I'm showing on my screen there? DiscipleOn is a 5-month community of leaders, and they're engaged in discipleship of their congregations from the stages perspective of discipleship, and they're united for group and peer coaching.
It's not up yet, Mike. Hold on, everyone. It looks like Mike froze, so I'm sure he's working on it. Hey, I think, Bob, were you going to be queued up to share about DiscipleOn? Is that what I remember?
That is correct. I'm relatively new to ascending leaders and certainly new to the DiscipleOn process. And while it's probably not accurate to say that we at Chapelwood are new to discipleship, we're kind of new to this strategic way of thinking of it in stages of faith and so forth. And so it was a real blessing for me, really, to find this online community of other people at other churches that are doing the same kind of work, and learning more about DiscipleOn through the info webinar that I think is about to come up. And Katie knows that even before the online process began, I really couldn't wait to get my hands on the Discipleship Vault. And that's a place online where we all share tools and resources, and just to be able to dig in and see what other people are doing. It's already been a big help to us. So it's been a great process for us.
Awesome. Thank you, Bob. And I would agree that the Vault has been a great resource for us as well, and we continue to learn from each other. Looks like we've lost Mike, and I don't know if he had any other closing comments, but I do want to certainly thank Mary and Richard for your expertise. Sounds like you're ahead of the game in many respects, and there's enormous benefit to be able to interact with you, and we're all practitioners trying to figure this out together. And so, yeah, I would like to just applaud your work and your effort. Thank you for being mentors for us today. And I consider myself a Timothy under some wonderful Paul and Pauline type people. So thanks for leading the way and giving us some great opportunities to interact with you and to learn from you today. And I want to say thanks to Mike for putting this together. He disappeared, but I will convey my thanks. And if there's more that we need to touch base with, please interact with either Katie or Mike or myself via email. And we will, I'm sure, be in touch. Our next DiscipleOn will be in, I think, either late May or early June. So we'll be in touch about that. So I just want to say thank you. Our time is about up.
Hang on just a second. I know he was going to talk about some info webinars that we have coming up. One is going to be on Wednesday, May the 24th at 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. Central Time. Sorry, Ken.
No, can you explain what that's the purpose of that?
It's just to give more information to those of you who have not participated in the DiscipleOn communities previously. If you have any questions, if you want to just know what this is about, Bob talked a little bit about the Vault. If you just want to see a little bit more information, find out some more information, and I believe Mike is back on real quick. The other one is in June, and it is on June, I don't remember. I'm sorry. I'll hush, Mike. You take over.
Well, I don't have it in front of me either. My internet went down, so I'm on my phone. But hey, I trust you guys have shared everything about it. You also just got an email from Katie with a link to a sheet where we'd love you to give your comments. At the end of every session Ascending Leaders does, we have this monkey we call Herbert. We throw from one person to another and ask people to say what was the best part of what they were just in. So you could, by going to that document that Katie just sent you a link to. Hey, we appreciate you all. We appreciate what you're doing. Thank you for being part of this. Richard and Mary, thank you very much for giving of yourselves, your time to answer our questions and to share with us. Thank you, everybody, and may God bless you with it. Oh, Katie wants to say something, and then...
Sorry, I just found it. The other one is on Wednesday, the 28th of June at 1:30 Central Time. So if you are, any of you all are interested in participating or want to know more information about DiscipleOn, just shoot me an email back, katie@ascendingleaders.com or .org, and I will give you the information so you can take your choice, whether it be in May or whether it be in June, where you want to get more information. That's it.
Hey, thank you. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, I'm just wanting, I'm sure somebody's going to ask, is this videotaped? And I know it is, and it will be up in the vault. So, Katie, can you just affirm that?
Yes, it is being recorded, and yes, it will be in the vault for those of you who are actually community members. And everybody else, we will figure out a way, if you would like to have the recording, we'll get it to you as well.
Yeah, Megan is planning on posting on our website, so it'll be public for anybody who wants it, as well as on the vault for participants. All right, everybody, thank you, and have a tremendous day. May God bless you and use you richly.
Bye-bye.